you very much, Liane, and thank you all for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to be here and have also the opportunity to be in Prague for the first time and see the city has been also very nice. So this is a nice way for me to say thank you for your hospitality. I selected obviously to discuss critical regionalism today because it's something that I have been working on for about a decade. So one of these 4 decades is 1 decade of me looking at this. And the book that came out of this research is this one. You don't need to spend money to buy it. You can download it directly from UCL Press. It's an open access PDF, so you get the whole book sitting in your laptop. If you decide to read it at some point, you read it. If not, it's there. So my talk today is based on part of this book, which is the epilogue, really, where after doing the research in history and looking in detail, I zoom out to look again back at the bigger picture. So if you like what you hear today, you can find out more in that epilogue. I usually start with this question of, what comes to mind when architects hear the words critical regionalism today. And usually most architects, I guess, would respond that critical regionalism is all about an opposition. And the opposition is between 2 things. One is the specific cultural identity of a place, and the other is what this regional identity is trying to oppose or to resist, which is the onslaught of globalization, which threatens to homogenize the world. And this is really the picture that is more or less sketched by some of the main theorists of critical regionalism. This is Liane, Lefaivre and Tzonis, the authors who first coined the term critical regionalism in the early 80s. And if you look at the subtitle of their most systematic account of this trend in architecture, it talks about peaks and valleys. So the peaks and valleys that resist the flattening of the world. Yes, so that's the whole idea behind it. But the question is whether, now that we're in 2023, 40 years after the first texts of critical regionalism were written, if these classes of the local and the global are really appropriate terms to talk about the complex reality of the world today. This is the first introduction of the term critical regionalism in a text published in a Greek architectural journal called Architecture in Greece. Obviously the world was very different in 1981 when this short essay was published. But it's not only that the world is different than what it was in the 80s. I also want to stress that the production of architectural theory, the way people write and think about architecture, is part of a historical process. It's always happening within a historical process. So what's interesting about critical regionalism, which is now considered to be the enemy of globalization, is that critical regionalism itself as a theory developed within that process as the process of globalization was taking place. So that is something that we need to have in mind. And obviously the process of globalization generated a lot of fierce debates, and probably they culminated in the anti-globalization movements, which were especially strong at the turn of the millennium. But again, I think this is a symptom of a movement that was in place in earlier decades. I think from the early 80s already, the global picture was really, was really much more complex than what Tzonis, Lefaivre or Kenneth Frampton would propose. Okay, so that's the basic framework of the talk. The way I'm going to do it, I'll try to show you how critical regionalism in many ways ended up supporting or inadvertently promoting what it was supposed to resist. And I will do so by starting from the differences between the worlds of now and then. And going back to these decades, I'll present you with 3 worlds, 3 returns, 3 globalizations, 3 colonizations, and 3 challenges for this decade. So, 3 worlds, the first decade of the 80s. Now, I always like the phrase by Milan Kundera, who said that whenever we think of the past from the vantage of the present, we tend to remove the mist of the present that was there when people were making their choices. We know how things turned out to be afterwards, and with that knowledge, we go back and say, oh, these people had this simple decision to make, why did they do this instead of that? And in some way, we remove the fog of the past from the past. So I think it's important to remember that, for example, the people who were active in the 80s did not necessarily imagine, for example, that the Berlin Wall would fall in 89 or that the Soviet bloc would implode within a couple of years in 1991. In other words, they did not know that the 20th century would turn out to be short, as Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, has argued in this book, The Age of Extremes, which is the short 20th century, the idea that the history or what the 20th century represented in global history ended with the implosion of the Soviet bloc. None of that was visible yet at the start of the 80s when the influential texts of critical regionalism were first written. The Soviet bloc, which was also known as the Second World, was still in the game. I mean, there had been a prolonged, exhaustive arms race with the US, but none of these two superpowers seemed to blink at the moment, and the prolonged Cold War was already 4 decades old. Nothing seemed capable of unsettling the well-established structure of the three worlds, and the historic agents of the 80s found it impossible to even imagine its collapse. And that was the case globally, whether one lived in the first world of the West or the second world of the Soviet bloc or the third world of the rising post-colonial nations. This is obvious if we look at science fiction of the period, for example, which kind of depicts the imaginary of its historical period. And if you look at Blade Runner, which this is supposed to be Los Angeles 4 years ago, 2019, as it was imagined in the early 80s. This world of the present, in that world of the present, the Soviet bloc is still going strong in 2019, and even in the recent sequel to the film, we still see CCCP and other things that allude to the presence of the Second World in 2049 when the sequel is taking place. So in some way, even 100 years later, the structure is there. Now, as you know, or you may remember from that period, the First World wants to show all the time how superior it is to the Second and the Third Worlds on all fronts, from the space race to the economic structures and the structures of governance, from individual liberties to architecture. Also, we have to remember that people who were living in that period were used to being afraid of the atomic bomb or some sort of nuclear disaster that would bring the whole world down. But the United States in that period wanted to show that they were a different kind of empire than the empires of the past. They were not based on firepower, but they were based on their kind of cultural superiority. So it's not about their guns, but it's about their politics, their economics, the way they organize their society. And it is this superiority that structures a kind of hierarchy between the three worlds. So the idea here, the idea that the United States want to propose to the world is that everything significant about world history happens in the United States, and then it slowly trickles down from the first world to the second world and to the third world. And the important thing is that this is a one-way street. There's nothing important happening in the third world that will affect developments in the first world. The idea is that it will always be the US that will be leading the way, and everything that happens there will be desirable in the other two worlds. And so I think that in some ways the concept of homogenization, the idea that globalization is turning the world into the same place everywhere, is still a remnant of that ideology, of the idea that there is a three-world structure and that one place is leading the way to the transformation of the whole world. So, if we have this in mind, and remember that the theories of critical regionalism were written in the early 80s, we can always remember that they're the children of this age of bipolarity. You had to take sides, whether you are with the US or with the Soviet bloc. But at the moment that these theories are written, is a kind of special moment for the world for the Cold War world, because already from the end of the 60s, we see many forms of thinking that try to transcend bipolar thinking, this idea that we always have to select something between two poles. And there are different types of thinking. Like, for example, if you look at philosophy, there is Jacques Derrida, who, with deconstruction, he's trying to say that what is important in thinking is not so much the two terms that are opposed, but always trying to keep the tension between them, so something else will emerge as a third kind of thing out of them. Or if you look at places like Iran or the Middle East, the Middle Eastern revolutions of the 70s were all about how we don't want to go with the Soviet bloc, we don't want to go with the US, but we kind of propose Islamic culture as something that is a kind of third way response to the problems of the world in the 80s. And later on, the books by Anthony Giddens, which are again trying to think of ways to look at the kind of third way between left and right. And in some way, critical regionalism is a kind of third way thinking for architecture. It's trying to say we don't want to become postmodernists with playful facades, but we also don't want to be modernists in the sense of technological boxes that are inserted into a landscape and completely ignore everything that happens around them. So again, it's a kind of third way option, and I think in this sense it belongs to this sort of thinking of that period, and it is representative of an intellectual horizon that is defined by two equally problematic options. And it seems like this horizon is not easy to transcend at that point, but it can still be subverted or cracked by this third alternative that all these kind of thinking are trying to propose. So another important aspect, I guess, in this is to consider how critical regionalism was a theory that was written between, let's say, between America and Europe. So it's written from a transatlantic space. The authors of critical regionalism are European migrants to the US. Politically, they identify either as socialists or as Marxists, but all of them try to keep their distance from the actually existing socialism of the Second World. Kenneth Frampton does this by looking at the political thinking of Hannah Arendt. Tzonis and Lefaivre, they write more specifically about the problems of the dominant bureaucratic state of the Soviet Union. And the so-called peripheral works that they use to develop the theory of critical regionalism. So this is Tzonis in Greece, Alvarado, Finland, Jörn Knutsson, Denmark. And these are all coming from Europe, yes? So they're all examples from the First World. And in many ways, while the theorists of critical regionalism seem to be trying to establish a different cultural circuit, as they're saying, and they want to say that the margins are important for the center, they do not really hit at the hardcore of the hierarchy of the three worlds. And they just encourage the creation of a cultural circuit within the First World, from its own peripheries, from the peripheries of the First World to the center of the First World. So in many ways, it's only reinforcing the cultural production of the First World from the inside, but it does not really question the primacy of the First World in relation to other parts of the world. And so the lessons from the periphery, whether they come from Greece, Denmark, Finland, or Italy, or Switzerland, or Japan, or Spain, these are all First World countries, and they are just at the borderlines of the First World, and their examples are good to return to the center. So when Frampton argues for enclaves of resistance to the expansion of the megalopolis, again he adopts the same kind of First World ideology, and again he presents the future of the First World as the unavoidable future of the rest of the world. He cites this work by an urban geographer, a very important book of the 60s. But again, this is a very limited study of an area of the US, and in Frampton's writing, this becomes a kind of universal model that the whole world is supposed to become this megalopolis, in the same way that it happened in the First World. And these terms of thinking are not really negotiable in Frampton's thinking. And the idea that resistance will also come from the First World is also non-negotiable. There is no other example that comes from another part of the world. So to recap a little bit, the extent of its application of the critical regionalist credo that the margins will become important for the center is really only limited to the First World. The Second World is, of course, completely absent from architectural studies of First World theorists, and everybody in the First World is actually really paying more attention to what will happen with the Third World. And in that context, critical regionalism becomes a kind of nice product for the Third World because it offers kind of easier way for all these underdeveloped so-called countries to ascend to the status of the First World slowly. So I think it's in its first years, critical regionalism does not really go out of the First World. It's just more like a project aligned with a transcultural vision of a rising European Union. It's not really a project for the whole globe. And this, of course, changes in the 90s because obviously we have the unexpected fall of the Berlin Wall and the very rapid implosion of the Soviet bloc. And this actually offers critical regionalism a new role in the discussion and a better defined opponent. Postmodernism is already kind of dissipating at that moment in history, so the major enemy of the past is no longer there, so the new enemy through which critical regionalism is redefined is globalisation. Within that context, the fall of the wall is actually giving birth to a lot of kind of triumphalist American thinkers suggesting that this is the end of history. The fall of one wall will lead to the fall of all walls. This will in turn lead to the fully emancipated development of the American empire. The world will become flat. The end of history is now. Every country that was in the former Eastern Bloc will jostle to become free market liberal democracy. These are the sort of things that these books are talking about. But the fall of the wall is also a challenge for Marxist thinking and left thinking in general. Already I think this sort of thinking about the world had given up on the idea of revolution, or there is nothing like the previous utopias of the early 20th century in Marxist thinking at that period. But one could say that the word resistance, which is also very important for critical regionalism, has become in these years, I would say it's a kind of postmodern version of revolution. If you cannot have revolution, you can at least have resistance. But at least now the opponent of critical regionalism becomes the neoliberal version of globalisation. And so, the peaks and valleys that critical regionalists would fight for actually resist the onslaught of this flat world. And at the same time, you have critical thinkers from the left critiquing the neoliberal model of globalisation and which is mainly motivated by capitalist economy, and they contrast this with this alternative term that they use, mondialisation, which has a kind of clearer social, cultural, and ecological orientation. Now, I've included the third way of looking at the world, which is included in Frampton's text. So, in the text of Kenneth Frampton, you don't see so much the word globalization or the globe, but you see the term world architecture. And I think this alludes to the slightly unclear concept of this very early idea of Goethe about Weltliteratur. And again, if Milan Kundera has written about it in some of his essays, where he's talking about how Weltliteratur is really about the fact that a cultural product is not necessarily better understood in its native country, but maybe in another national context. And Kundera talks about how Rabelais, for example, who wrote in French, was better understood by Bakhtin, a Russian, or how the Norwegian Henrik Ibsen was better understood by an Irishman, George Bernard Shaw, and so on. So this is more really about a free cultural exchange between co-equals on the same transnational platform. In this context, the Second World, and especially the European states of the former Soviet bloc, slowly entered the field of architectural history, and this is probably a book by Anthony Alofsin, who is somehow part of the early history of critical regionalism. In the 90s, he actually gets some European funding and works with a series of architectural historians from Romania, from Central Europe, and they try to look at that sort of history, which was until then sort of inaccessible for the Western world. And in some ways, one can see how historiography becomes also part of the huge European project of building a common European identity that can accommodate multiple voices. At the same time, the other theorists of critical regionalism, Tzonis and Lefaivre, in their texts, they start talking about how the theory of critical regionalism has somehow been misunderstood, because they want to say that, you do not need to be Catalan to build a nice building in Barcelona. You can do critical regionalism in Barcelona without being Catalan. And somehow they start stressing the idea that the things that critical regionalism is all about should be part of the universal skills of an architect. It's not necessarily about being specifically from Greece to design a nice building in Athens, for example. But at the same time, this move really paves the way for the development of an alternative globalized star system of critical regionalism. So if you're saying that this is part of the universal skills of an architect, then we can commission Mario Botta and we can commission Tadao Ando to build anywhere in the world, and we can be happy. And what happens is essentially you can see that many architects of critical regionalism since then have become, received the Pritzker Prize of Architecture. About 25% of the Pritzker Prize winners are critical regionalist architects or somehow associated with that. And in some way, even if in theory they're more socially or culturally sensitive, what we basically have is an alternative star system of architecture which works in the same terms of neoliberal globalization. So in some way, again, we see how the theories of critical regionalism are generating something that partially produces what they're fighting against. And in the following decade, Tzonis and Lefebvre's theorizations extend to include such works by architects in other geographic areas, and these are usually coming from formerly colonized states, which leads us to the notice and the start of discussion in terms of colonial and post-colonial discourse. And these are just two of the most important articles that came out at the start of this century. by Keith Egener and Mark Rinson. And in these very important critical texts, Keith Egener argues that critical regionalism is really an inherently colonial discourse because, as he says, and I quote, it actively pushes to the margin, end of quote, the areas that it discusses. So in other words, the areas that are discussed by Frampton, Tzonis and Lefaivre did not necessarily understand themselves as marginal before they were discussed in these terms by Frampton and others. They just understood themselves as working within their context and being important for their local world, but without thinking whether they are marginal or something like that. So it disempowers them. In addition, architectures of critical regionalism are presented in terms of abstract dichotomies. So in Frampton's texts, you will see a lot the discussion around the opposition between technology and place. But this sometimes is a way of thinking that works very much with idealized impressions of the developments in other countries without looking at the historical and cultural context that produces this architecture in a specific place. So in many ways, even though they describe themselves as Marxists or socialists, the theorists of critical regionalism very often do not really address the social and political context that gives rise to the architectures that they promote. And when Tzonis and Lefaivre discuss the works of critical regionalism in the tropics, this is a book that came out in that decade. What they do is that they usually refer to first world architects who built there. When Frampton, if you've read Frampton's most well-known text on critical regionalism, you will remember that it starts with this very long quote by Paul Ricoeur, which poses the big question, how to become modern and return to sources at the same time. But what is interesting is that if you look at Paul Ricoeur's text, there is a part of it that is missing here. And that part is really adding a very clear post-colonial context to the question of how to become modern and return to sources. Because it's talking about, this is a question that comes up in the form of a dilemma or a vicious circle, and it is part of the fight against colonial powers and struggles for liberation. It is for these nations that this question, this kind of paradoxical question is becoming important, because in some way getting rid of the colonists would mean also getting rid of the modern in some way. And so how do you become both modern and return to sources at the same time? If you're interested in this sort of discussion, the text by Mark Rinson is talking a lot more about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it now. I want to also talk about how critical regionalism is not really following with what happens at the time. It's not really ever discussing colonialism. It kind of omits the question, which is again strange, because historically critical regionalism actually developed at the very same moment that something like this, Edward Said's most important first study of Orientalism, which came out in 1978. So really the same years that Tzonis and Lefaivre were actually writing. And it's interesting because they were both in Ivy League institutions, and Tzonis and Lefaivre were really very good readers and very, very knowledgeable. If you meet them, you're impressed by how much they have read and know. So it's kind of strange that post-colonialism, which includes a lot of important cultural sensitivities that they want to discuss through critical regionalism, is not becoming part of their thinking. And it seems like these two lines of thinking develop in parallel without meeting. So in some way, the theory of critical regionalism that Tzonis and Lefaivre really want to develop over that decade remains a historiographical work in the global Western European colonial tradition in some way. It does not offer really a clear analysis of cross-cultural exchange, and the networks of power, hierarchy, inequity that often condition these exchanges are not part of the picture here. And I want to argue that this is not only because from the outset critical regionalism was generated or stayed within the West, but it is also because I think the discourse of critical regionalism was never really looking towards the future or the present, but it was actually motivated by the past. And I want to argue that critical regionalism is really the 80s return of the 60s. And that is, I think, the case in three ways. One is if we go back and look at Frampton's texts and the projects that are usually the main references of these texts, one can wonder if we look just at the projects, for example, if this theory is systematic or consistent after all, or whether it is just all about theoretically legitimizing a specific aesthetic preference, kind of quiet modernism, one might say. And this is an interview of Kenneth Frampton from the mid-80s, where he seems to confirm this. And I think, in the final instance, these are the texts from a British historian whose formative years in architecture coincided with the generation of the brutalists in the early 60s in the UK. And if we look, for example, at Frampton's, these are the 31 issues of architectural design that Frampton edited from 1962 to January 1965. So this is 15 years before he has ever written a single line on critical regionalism, but already you can see that he's interested in the work of Greek architects or the work of Mexican architects, and he's kind of looking at different parts of the world to look at peripheral, let's say, modernisms of the first world. And I think in many ways the context of his thinking, from his Marxism to the architectural language of quiet modernism he seems to prefer, this comes entirely from the 60s. So in many ways, the theory of critical regionalism might be what remains as nostalgia after the revolution of 1968 is cancelled. And it is an attempt to provincialize the scenographic postmodern architecture of the 80s. But the alternative to that is with an arrière-garde. Frampton is talking really about how critical regionalism is not about an avant-garde anymore, something that is at the forefront, as one would expect from the avant-garde of the 30s, but it's at the rear, trying to resist and protect what is under threat. But what is interesting is that both the avant-garde and the arrière-garde are equally marginal social practices. And so in some way, the arrière-garde and the arrière-garde of the 80s and the avant-garde of the 30s are communicating in that way. They're both equally marginal, and in some way, the arrière-garde is nostalgic of the avant-garde of the 30s. And one last way I think that the 60s are still there in critical regionalism is that many of the concepts of the 60s are proposed as responses to challenges of the 80s. So, for example, one important thing that postmodern theorists were talking about in the period was that we need to address pluralistic societies that need to be tolerant, we need to coexist and accept multiple points of view, and so on. When Frampton was asked about this question, he said, yes, of course, we can have pluralist architecture in the same way that Tim 10 from the 60s was a pluralist practice so there is an alternative to that. Or if you look at Tzonis and Lefaivre's texts, in the end they stress the need to transform the relations between designers and users in much the same way as the participatory design debates of the 60s were all about. And I think in many ways they do not really transgress the social democratic model of the welfare state of European reconstruction. And so, in many ways, their thinking is still within the boundaries of capitalism with a human face, as they used to say, I guess. And this idea that critical regionalism is a kind of humanistic project, or Frampton's idea that the modern language of architecture takes precedence over any other language of architecture, or Paul Ricoeur's thinking. All these things are really the footprints of 60s thinking in the critical regionalist theories of the 80s. And if we come closer to the present, I think, and to come back to the title of the talk, I think there are many ways in which we can rethink critical regionalism today in that light. One is that recently critical regionalism seems to have attracted interest again. So this is the Kenneth Frampton's Golden Lion Award in Venice, or some recent issues of OASE or the Architectural Review, which are trying to reappraise critical regionalism as a theory for architectural design today. And I think it's important to remember that many of the main principles of critical regionalism form part of architectural education today. The emphasis on place, on landscape, the climate and the conditions, the orientations of buildings on their sites, locally sourced materials, regional building cultures, they are all, if you go to any school of architecture of the European or American countries, at least at the moment, you would see that these sensibilities would all be there somewhere in some of the design studios. But again, it might be important to remember or ask ourselves whether they still have the same value in the age of a climate emergency like the one we're facing today. And here we might find that some of the underlying terms of the 60s that are still in place within that theory, like for example the fetishization of concrete as a building material in the West, which we now know is pretty problematic in terms of its carbon footprint, they could be a problem because there is a specific aesthetic that comes with critical regionalism, and this needs to be theoretically reconsidered. But on the positive side, one could say that critical regionalism is a discourse that is inherently related with the question of sustainability in architecture. So it is at least theoretically possible to update it for the present and make it more relevant from the standpoint of climate change. But one might say, okay, there are other ways to look at critical regionalism and other ways to look at it as a sort of history. Critical regionalism is about my age, so middle-aged theory. It is about, it has its own history at the moment. There is, and this history needs to be written because history is always, if we go back to that question of the fog of the present, in many ways writing a history helps us clear up some of the blind spots that are still there, sometimes inherent in practices and discourses. So some of them I tried to cover in today's presentation, but obviously there could be more. And one has to remember that critical regionalism is not really only about the 80s, but some of the discussions about regionalism in architecture have deeper roots in history, and they go further back than the 20th century probably. And also, maybe we need to consider how critical regionalism was a cross-cultural process of writing that involved Tzonis, Lefaivre, Frampton, but not only the texts of these people. It also includes buildings, it also includes original texts by the architects that were first presented as critical regionalists and their own ideas and their own concerns about the regional in modern architecture and after modern architecture. So in some way, critical regionalism represents a point where these discussions culminate and reach a kind of peak in the 80s, but this does not mean that I think there is a lot to be unearthed through historical research. And also we might want to remember that as a sort of architectural discourse, critical regionalism became a historic agent in itself when these people were first introduced as global superstars in their local contexts, this affected their relations with others or the national context in which they practiced. So this is also part of the history of critical regionalism now, how it itself as a discourse became an important actor in historical developments in these places. So I think critical regionalism, if we're looking at its authorship, we need to look at it as a sort of rhizome. This is a single root of a bamboo forest. And if we're looking at it, we're looking at a network of things where we cannot see where something ends or something begins. We can see many connections, we cannot see clear boundaries. And I think it's a nice metaphor for thinking of critical regionalism and the way it was offered in history as a sort of cross-cultural network, where there's a lot of branching, there's a lot of circulation of relevant ideas from humans to buildings to texts to institutions to all sorts of things that are usually involved in producing architectural theory. And there is one last way in which we could look at critical regionalism, because somebody might say, okay, I'm not interested in critical regionalism, it is a theory of the past, it does not have a place in the present, so I'm not even interested in looking at it as history. But maybe we can still think of a way of critical regionalism surviving as historiography, as something that can be a new agenda for writing the history of architecture in the 21st century. And I think there is a way one could argue this is an interesting point of thinking about critical regionalism, because as this artist was showing in 2009, we currently have 70 more walls around the world than we did in the 90s. So all these prophecies about the fall of one wall leading to the fall of all walls did not really materialize. We're actually moving in an opposite direction, and there is a lot more alt-right nationalist isolationism at play in the political climate of the present. So I've tried to somehow use the 5 points of critical regionalism that Frampton proposed as ways in which we can think of architectural historiography. So the first point was about how critical regionalist architects are interested in the small plan instead of the big plan. And if we apply that to history, we could say that critical regionalism as a discourse always promoted the work of a talented individual who was supposed to be producing the best moment or exemplifying the essence of a collective culture. And in many cases, these figures became some sort of tokens for entire countries. So for Greece, it was Susanna and Dimitris Antonakakis, for example. Or for Italy, it could be Carlos Kappa, or Venice. So, but obviously, the national territory of a country is home to many cultural expressions. So a kind of stronger emphasis on small plan historiography could be a better way to look at specificities of context that produce this sort of architecture. The second point is coming out of the first one, was that in critical regionalism there is an assumption that architectural regions are the same as national territories. So an architectural region is what is within the national borders of a country. But if we just look at the recent history of the 20th century world, we witness the historical emergence of about 100 post-colonial states, decolonized nation states after 1945. So, how is it possible to talk about national borders as defining areas of the world? And so a new historiography would not look at freestanding national histories, or as critical regionalism was critical of freestanding buildings on landscapes, but it would be a new history that is trying to look at interactions, intersections, overlaps, cross-cultural exchanges, and co-productions of architectures across these regions. The third point would be about discarding all this essentialism of critical regionalism, of the opposition between place, production, and technology. But starting looking at these things as modes of production of regional architectures in their specificity in its context. And we need to keep in mind even that some of these concepts, like even the idea of cultural identity, for example, is a 19th century European concept, and it's probably a trademark of European romantic nationalism and the footprint of its imperialist history on colonized cultures, because it comes with somehow with the colonizers, this idea of cultural identity that is then promoted as a mode of resistance. So if we start looking in those terms and remember that the post-colonial identities are never static but always hybrid, they're never pure, again we might be able to unearth some of that history of imperialism that is still conditioning our understanding of the past. The fourth point, and I have this and the last point, and then you are free to discuss or go away. Critical regionalism was historically developed by scholars who worked from a transatlantic space, as I was saying, and they were affiliated with very strong Ivy League institutions in the US or very prestigious universities in Europe. And the first, I think it's interesting to remember that the first text on critical regionalism, which was on the Greek architects Susanna and Dimitris Antonakakis, was written by Tzonis, so a Greek scholar who was writing from an American institution. And he had this sort of informed insider's view of Greek culture. And then Lefaivre, who was born in Canada and became Tzonis' partner in the 70s, she had a stronger background in the humanities, and when they started writing together, she kind of brought in the discourse of Tzonis, some new dimensions, one could say, or some new interests. And one could see that, for example, in that first text on critical regionalism, they do not only discuss architecture, but also the work of Greek poets or artists of that period. And I think, and they also highlighted some links of all these cultural practices with longer standing European currents. So I think in the 21st century, if we are going to use critical regionalism as a sort of historiographic agenda, we can develop them more fully into some sort of interdisciplinary histories or understandings of cultural developments in specific regions. And we could cover a ground that would go from the arts to critical archaeologies. And I think that is also important because historians themselves, bring with them the cultural luggage that conditions the way they understand the past. And it would be good to acknowledge sometimes the Western luggage that we bring when we look into the architectures of other regional cultures. And the last point is really about how critical regionalism always favored the Western conception of modernity. So when Frampton originally wrote about critical regionalism, I quote him, he thought it is a revisionist variant of modernism. And because that was the case, he also established a sort of hierarchy between architectural languages. So if you look at the examples he selected, the more one project follows modernist abstraction, the stronger, the more legitimate it becomes to be added to the critical regionalist canon. If it has a lot of figurations and this sort of regionalist features, it's not considered as strong. And maybe this is also the hardest core of imperialism and colonialism within critical regionalism. Because really none of the critical regionalist projects or writings actually challenge the superiority of Western modernism. And to use some of the phrases that Frampton is using, everything else that is not modernist could become inserted into this sort of design only as disjunctive episodes or regional adaptations of modernism. So again, modernist would be the first, and then everything else would have to come under this umbrella. So today, I think it could be an opportunity in 21st century historiography to think non-hierarchically about architectural modernities that are not necessarily about Western educated architects in non-Western contexts. So some of the books that came out recently about Chinese modernism, for example, they focus on architects like Liu Himshou, who studied in London and then returned to China to build modernism in China. But obviously, the history of how modernism or modernity developed in other contexts is much richer than this, where we essentially have the same kind of system where someone is going to the Western centers and then bringing back this knowledge to their national context for it to be absorbed. So again, I think a closer inspection of the deeper links between nationalism, imperialism, and colonialism is necessary. And this new historiography would include challenging established concepts, starting from the so-called non-West itself, and readdressing questions of provinciality, or even thinking about the narrative structures that we use when we write histories, where in the West we have these ideals of resolution, closure, catharsis, but we also have narrative structures and traditions that are not from the West, and they are not about all these things, but they're more about ambiguity and contradiction and open-endedness. So I think that would be a nice way to finish with this talk and think of how we can conceptualize hybrid modernities and stop thinking of the different or the non-West as a mirror of the first world of the West. Okay, that's it. If you want to read more, go to the last 40 pages of this book, but I'm also happy to answer questions. Thank you for your attention.